My name is Richard Sterling, and at exactly 8:14 p.m., my mother leaned across the pristine white damask of the head table, her diamonds catching the chandelier light, and softly told me I was being erased from the family legacy. She smiled as she said it, a practiced, country club smile that suggested she was merely passing the salt. What she didn't know was that 3 months ago, I had quietly invoked Section 409A of the corporate bylaws, restructuring the family's foundational real estate trust. By the time the main course was served, I didn't just walk away from their table. I legally repossessed the very ground their empire was built upon, leaving them entirely bankrupt in the silence of their own celebration. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we tell quiet, true-to-life family stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stopped shrinking to fit a seat they were never offered. If you've ever had to earn your place at your own family's table, this one is for you. Drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. The house on Stonebridge Lane always smelled of coal mahogany, beeswax, and unread contracts. It was an imposing colonial estate in the hills of Greenwich, Connecticut, a structure designed less for comfort and more to project an image of unyielding multi-generational permanence. Every hallway was lined with oil paintings of ancestors who had built their wealth on the backs of quiet compromises, and every room felt like a courtroom where you were constantly on trial for simply existing. The floors were a polished herringbone oak that creaked only if you stepped on the seams, teaching me from a very young age to watch exactly where I placed my feet. Growing up, love was not a feeling in our household. It was a performance metric. My father, Julian Sterling, was a senior partner at a white shoe private equity firm. He only spoke to me when a NASDAQ closed, and even then, his gaze usually drifted over my shoulder toward the television screen, tracking the futures market. If the market was down, the dinner table was a frozen tundra of silent disapproval, where the only sound was the scraping of silver against porcelain. If the market was up, he only spoke to my older brother, Julian Jr., discussing golf handicaps, Ivy League admissions, and international trade agreements as if I were a ghost sitting at the far end of the mahogany table. My mother, Eleanor, viewed her children as assets to be managed, polished, and displayed at seasonal fundraisers. She spent hours curating our outfits, our manners, and our public statements, ensuring that the Sterling name remained synonymous with flawless perfection. She would adjust my collar with a grip that felt like a vice, whispering that a Sterling never looked disheveled in public. Yet her eyes would completely look past me the moment a photographer came near. Behind the closed, heavy oak doors of our home, the perfection dissolved into a cold, calculated hierarchy where everything was transactional. In the Sterling family structure, Julian and Eleanor were the absolute architects of our lives. Julian Jr. was the favored asset, the prodigal son who could commit no sin, while I was merely a line item on a ledger, a necessary expense, but a liability nonetheless. My profession as a forensic accountant and trust auditor was a constant source of quiet humiliation for them. To my family, my profession was an embarrassment, a trade rather than a legacy. They viewed me as a glorified clerk, someone to be whispered about in hushed tones at cocktail parties, someone to be summoned only when the taxes needed filing or when a financial discrepancy required a quiet resolution. They wanted a son who would rule boardrooms with loud, empty promises. Instead, they got a son who knew how to read the fine print. I learned very early that I was considered a low-yield investment. Julian Jr. possessed the loud, effortless charisma that my parents mistook for leadership. He went to Princeton, joined the right final clubs, and smiled for the local lifestyle magazines. But behind his expensive suits and white-toothed smile lay a trail of profound financial incompetence. I, on the other hand, was quiet. I preferred the cold, objective certainty of numbers. Numbers do not lie, they do not flatter, and they do not have favorites. I spent my 20s earning credentials as a specialist in asset tracing and trust litigation, learning how to find money that wealthy people desperately try to hide from the government, from their business partners, and from their spouses. I watched silently for over a decade as my father transferred prime commercial real estate holdings into LLCs controlled entirely by Julian Jr. Despite my brother's compounding, drug-fueled debts, and catastrophic failures in cryptocurrency speculation, Julian Jr. would invest millions of dollars into failing tech startups or overseas real estate ventures that existed only on paper, and when the margins evaporated, he would come crawling back to the Greenwich estate. Every time Julian Jr. lost $1 million, my father would quietly cover the deficit by liquidating minor funds that had been set aside for my independent practice, assuming I would never notice the steady drain on my inheritance. I kept my mouth shut when my mother reallocated my grandmother's trust fund, the one explicitly promised to fund my independent corporate compliance firm, to cover Julian Jr.'s quiet, out-of-court settlement with a former executive assistant. I remember the day she did it. She didn't look me in the eye. She simply pushed a piece of paper across the desk and asked me to review the tax implications of the transfer. Her voice was as smooth as silk as she told me that Julian Jr.'s career was at a critical juncture and that my little accounting project could wait a few more years. I never argued. I never raised my voice. I never slammed a door or demanded my fair share. I simply observed, taking meticulous mental inventory of every transaction, every signature, and every legal shortcut my father took to keep my brother afloat. I spent my nights printing out bank statements, tracking international wire transfers, and cataloging every single time my father breached his fiduciary duty as the trustee of our family estate. I understood what they did not. Charisma is a depreciating asset, but a poorly structured deed is forever. They believed my silence was submission, but in reality, it was preparation. The setting was Van Terre, an ultra-exclusive, Michelin-starred restaurant overlooking the Manhattan skyline, reserved entirely for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. The room was a study in understated opulence, muted gray velvet walls, baccarat crystal, and the soft, rhythmic clinking of silver against porcelain. 20 of the tri-state area's most powerful corporate dynasties sat at the long, single-piece oak table, their conversations a low hum of stock options, summer homes, and political donations. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged wine, a room where power was wielded not with a hammer, but with a pen. Julian Jr. sat to my father's right, sweating slightly beneath his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, his laughter just a fraction too loud as he tried to impress a managing director from a major investment bank. He poured more wine into his glass, his hand trembling slightly, a telltale sign that his private debts were finally catching up to him. I was placed at the far end of the table, directly next to the kitchen service doors, a deliberate piece of social geography engineered by my mother to show the room exactly where I stood in the family order. Every time a waiter passed through the doors, a draft of cold air hit my back, a physical reminder of my exile. Halfway through the second course, a delicate turbot in saffron emulsion, my father stood up to make his highly anticipated toast. He tapped his crystal glass with a silver fork, and the room fell into an immediate, respectful silence. He spoke eloquently about legacy, continuity, the weight of the family name, and the bright future of Sterling Holdings. He painted a picture of a seamless transition of power from one generation to the next, emphasizing the importance of keeping the core assets within the hands of those who truly understood the family's vision. Then he paused, turned his head, and looked directly down the length of the long table at me. "We are announcing tonight," my father said, his voice smooth, clear, and utterly devoid of hesitation, "that Julian Jr. will be assuming the role of sole managing member of the Stonebridge Trust, absorbing all auxiliary family holdings, including the Greenwich estate. We believe that centralized leadership is essential for the next chapter of our family's journey." A polite, rehearsed murmur of applause rippled through the room. My mother turned her head toward me, her eyes completely cold behind her designer frames. She leaned in close across the table, keeping her voice at a sharp whisper that didn't disturb the cello soloist playing softly in the corner of the room. She reached out and patted my hand, but her touch lacked any trace of maternal warmth. "We needed to consolidate, Richard," she whispered, her smile perfectly intact for the benefit of the sitting opposite her. "Julian Jr. represents the family name and the future of the firm. Your lifestyle, your little accounting firm. It doesn't require this level of capital. We've removed you from the trust rotation entirely. We need you to sign the quitclaim deeds for the Greenwich estate tomorrow morning at 9. The family lawyers have already prepared the paperwork, and it's for the best of the family name." My pulse remained at a perfectly steady 64 beats per minute. I did not blink. I did not let my hands shake. I placed my silver fish knife precisely at a 45-degree angle on the edge of my plate. I looked around the room, identifying the 3 exit doors, and noted that the firm's general counsel, Arthur Pendleton, was sitting just 4 seats away from my father. Arthur was looking down at his lap, intensely interested in his napkin, unable to meet my gaze because he knew exactly what they were doing to me was a legal execution. I felt the collective eyes of the entire table shift toward me, waiting for a fracture, a flush of color in my cheeks, a stammered protest, or a bitter argument. Julian Jr. was smirking from the other end, raising his glass to me in a silent gesture of absolute victory. They wanted a reaction to validate their choice, to prove that I was the unstable, bitter son who didn't deserve a place at the table. I gave them nothing. I took a slow, measured breath, feeling the cool, filtered air fill my lungs, and looked my mother dead in the eyes. I didn't say a single word. I simply picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth with absolute deliberation, and sat in absolute, terrifying serenity. What my parents had forgotten, or perhaps never cared to learn because they viewed me as a mere clerk, was that 3 years ago, during a severe liquidity crisis at Sterling Holdings, my father had desperately asked me to review the overarching framework of the Stonebridge Trust, to save on municipal taxes and shield their assets from potential creditors. He had authorized me to merge all the family's holding companies into a singular Delaware statutory trust. He had signed the authorization forms without reading them, assuming his quiet son was simply doing routine paperwork to minimize their tax burden. During that extensive restructuring, I discovered a fatal flaw in my father's original corporate bylaws dating back to 1994. Under Delaware Code Title 12, if a family trust utilizes corporate assets to settle personal, non-disclosed liabilities, such as Julian Jr.'s multiple off-the-books legal settlements, luxury car leases, and gambling debts, the immunity of the primary trustee is completely pierced. Furthermore, Section 409A of the agreement stipulated that any removal or reallocation of a primary beneficiary's shares without a unanimous vote of the auditing committee automatically triggered an immediate, non-waivable, deep-dive forensic audit of the underlying assets. I had spent the last 90 days quietly preparing for this exact night. I didn't plan a loud confrontation. I compiled data. I had tracing logs, bank routing numbers, certified court records, and signed affidavits from the offshore entities Julian Jr. had used to drain the corporate cash reserves with my father's implicit permission. I had working relationships with the regulatory boards, and I had already filed the necessary paperwork with the state authorities under whistleblower protection laws 48 hours prior to this dinner. As the dessert course was being cleared, I didn't reach for a pen to sign a quitclaim deed. Instead, I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a slim, matte black leather folder containing 4 copies of a formal notice of material breach and asset seizure. I stood up from my seat near the kitchen doors, walked calmly and deliberately to the head of the table, and placed the documents directly in front of my father, my mother, Julian Jr., and Arthur Pendleton, the general counsel. The documents laid out the evidence piece by piece like exhibits in a federal courtroom. There were bank statements showing exactly where $4.2 million had been moved from the corporate maintenance funds to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands to cover my brother's private debts. There were copies of the Delaware statutory trust filings showing that by removing me from the trust without an audit, my father had automatically defaulted on the primary loan that kept Sterling Holdings afloat. A loan that was held by a private boutique investment firm I had quietly purchased through an anonymous LLC 6 months ago. "What is this?" "Richard," my father muttered, his voice dropping an octave, his hand tightening around his wine glass, so hard the stem creaked under the pressure. The irritation in his voice was palpable, but beneath it lay the first faint tremor of unease. "That," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, resonant clarity that caused the entire room to fall dead silent, "is an immediate freeze on all liquidity accounts tied to Sterling Holdings. Because you executed an unauthorized beneficiary removal tonight without an independent audit, you have triggered the default clauses of the 2023 Delaware Restructuring Agreement. You are no longer the trustee, Father. As of 9 minutes ago, the state has appointed an independent receiver to oversee all assets." Julian Jr. went pale, the color draining from his face until his skin matched the white porcelain plates on the table. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He looked at the bank routing numbers listed on page 4 and realized his private financial life was completely exposed to the federal regulators. "Richard, stop this nonsense right now," he hissed, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. "The Greenwich estate," I continued calmly, looking directly at my mother, whose smile had completely vanished, leaving her face looking old and drawn under the chandelier light, "is no longer yours to give to Julian Jr. It was used as collateral for the liquidity injection I provided through my private firm last winter to save you from bankruptcy. As of 8:15 p.m. tonight, due to your material misrepresentation of trust assets, that note has been called. The property now belongs entirely to my independent holding group. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The locks will be changed on the 1st of the month." Arthur Pendleton opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first 3 pages with practiced speed. I watched the exact second his face turned completely white and his jaw subtly dropped. He didn't even look at my father. He simply closed the folder, slid it away from himself, and gave a microscopic, definitive shake of his head. The realization hit the table like a physical blow. They didn't just lose an argument. They realized they had lost their entire lifestyle, their wealth, and their standing in the community in less than 5 minutes. The trap was absolute, entirely legal, and completely irreversible. I turned away from the table, leaving them in the suffocating silence of their own undoing. The aftermath did not involve shouting matches, dramatic public scenes, or lengthy court battles. The law does not need to shout when it is written in ironclad, undeniable ink. When the evidence is absolute, there is no room for negotiation, no room for family leverage, and no room for excuses. My father tried to call my office 17 times over the following weeks, but every call was automatically routed to my legal counsel, who gave them the exact same answer every time. Follow the terms of the settlement. The Greenwich house on Stonebridge Lane was sold 4 months later to an institutional buyer who turned the historic estate into a private corporate retreat center. I watched from my office window as the moving trucks cleared out the cold mahogany furniture, the expensive oil paintings, and the decades of accumulated pretense. My parents were forced to downsize drastically, moving into a leased 2-bedroom condominium in a quiet, less prestigious part of New Jersey, far away from the country clubs and social circles they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. They no longer attend the seasonal fundraisers, and their names have been quietly scrubbed from the boards of the local charities. Julian Jr. filed for personal bankruptcy within 6 months, his reputation completely shattered within the financial community. No firm in New York would touch him after the forensic audit report became public record. He eventually took a quiet, low-level job at a mid-tier logistics firm in Ohio, where his Ivy League pedigree and loud charisma meant absolutely nothing to the people moving freight. He lives in a small apartment, spending his evenings calculating the debts he can never hope to repay. I didn't take the money to fund a lavish, vengeful lifestyle or to flaunt my victory to the world. I didn't buy a bigger house or an expensive sports car. Instead, I used the liquidated assets of Sterling Holdings to establish a permanent, self-sustaining endowment for young professionals from marginalized backgrounds. People who possess the intelligence and the drive, but lack the generational capital or family support to start their own legal and financial practices. I built the table that my parents refused to let me sit at, but I built it for people who actually earned their right to be there. I don't speak to my parents or my brother anymore. People often ask me if I feel guilty for exposing them or if I regret the absolute destruction of the family name. I tell them no. The silence between us is not born of anger, malice, or resentment. It is simply the final, unyielding boundary of a man who realized his worth could never be calculated by people who are morally bankrupt. I stopped waiting for them to see me, and in doing so, I finally saw myself. I traded a toxic family legacy for my own dignity, and that is a transaction I would make again every single day. If someone in your life only values you when you're useful, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.